I'm going to give a little bit of a historical account mixed in with a personal story about how the Unions for Energy Democracy organization evolved, why, and what's the basic case for public renewable power energy democracy. So I'm going to go into some details about that. So it's divided into sort of 4 parts. I'm going to start with this sort of recent history since 2006 around the UN climate talks and some of the debates there, how the energy democracy narrative becomes rising within the global trade union movement and also in the United States, a word about what it is and how we can make it work and why it's crucially important that we succeed, and where globally is it happening? Because if we don't have examples, it's kind of hard to live in the world of abstraction. So those are the sort of 4 areas I want to try to cover in the 30 or so minutes I've got. So starting 10, 12 years ago, 2006, I was part of the first US trade union delegation to the UN climate talks in Bali, actually in 2007. And that period, 2006, 2007, was a very interesting, important period for the climate debate and the climate movement. And the Kyoto Treaty, which many of you know, was the first attempt really to control emissions, saying that we have a problem here called global warming, and we need, the rich countries have to take the lead and reduce their emissions by 5% or so. Don't have time to go into all the details. But that was beginning to expire, and the debate over what's the next agreement going to look like was then beginning to gather pace. And a number of things happened there. First of all, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a body of scientists, many of you know this, and they came up with these targets for emissions reductions, which led to thousands of people at the Bali talks literally to have their jaws hit the floor, saying that the science was so much more serious now compared to where it had been even 5 years before, that nothing short of an 85% reduction of emissions by 2050 based on 1990 levels was the minimum needed to keep the world within safe or relatively safe temperature thresholds of 2 degrees. Later on, of course, that has been even more severe, both the scientific projections and the emissions reductions trajectories. I'll come back to that in a moment. So that was one thing. The other was the release of a report by the former head of the World Bank, Nicholas Stern, later Sir Nicholas Stern, and now Lord Nicholas Stern. So here's the guy who was basically said, this is not a problem. All we need to do is to price the externality, carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions. If polluters paid for their pollution, over time, if the price was raised on that charge, the carbon price, then investment would go towards the green stuff. Problem solved. So that was the projection. So there was this sense that with the science, with the Economics of Climate Change report, that the transition to a low-carbon economy was inevitable. And I underscore that because time after time, speech after speech, the word inevitable was used. 12 years later, they're still using the word inevitable. But I want to come back to that in a moment. What's inevitable? And what role do we play in this? So the labor movement was attending these climate talks very much in a small minority. It's not a top priority. It wasn't then and it isn't now for the labor movement, who are struggling to survive, not just in this country but elsewhere. But they took the view, what I think they should be acknowledged for their role in this, that the science was important. There was no negotiating with these emissions reductions trajectories, that this was necessary. And what workers needed to do, or workers' representatives, was to make sure that workers didn't actually get thrown under the bus by these reductions. If there were going to be reductions in emissions, that's going to affect energy-intensive industries, and that will mean workers will lose their jobs. So the emphasis was on just transition, a term that grew up in the US trade union movement with the oil, chemical, and atomic workers under the leadership of the late Tony Mazzocchi back in the 1980s. So just transition was the demand, and on top of that was green jobs, because if we needed a low-carbon future and these aggressive science targets were necessary, that's going to create tens of millions of jobs around the world. So we want those jobs, and we want them to be good jobs. So these were the basic demands, but it never challenged the idea that the transition itself was inevitable. In fact, many union leaders said, this is going to happen, we have to be prepared for the future, etc., etc. Now, let's go to 2009 and the Copenhagen Accord. Again, some of you are familiar with this history, so I apologize to you, but for those who are not familiar, I think there's a real important lesson here. The United States, with a number of other countries, decided that a legally binding agreement on emissions reductions was not necessary. This was the Obama administration, not the Trump administration. Obama said that every country should put on the table a pledge, what they think they can do, and then we will review that pledge against the science. And so the Copenhagen Accord changed the whole legal architecture of the global climate talks from one that was a mandatory, legally binding agreement, the sort of thing you see in world trade discussions, for example, with their legally binding agreements, to one which was a pledge and review voluntary agreement. And I say this because a lot of people look back at the Obama period with some nostalgia, especially given the person we have in the White House at the moment, the predator in chief. So they look at Obama as like a climate hero, and that's not true. And I think we have to be absolutely clear when we have conversations. In 2012, it was again in Rio, and there was a big conference hall of unions, just unions, saying, what are our demands at this Earth Summit? And the issue of climate change and the green economy came up, of course, was the main focus of the trade union assembly. And something very significant happened there. I was privileged enough to be in the room. The United Nations Environment Programme, the various agencies, the World Bank, got up and addressed this trade union audience and said, the transition to a low-carbon economy is inevitable. And all we need to do is make sure that we're trying to have a just transition, and we can leave it to market forces to address this problem called climate change. The reaction was very, very angry from the group. These were mostly unions from Latin America, but there were also very many representatives from unions from around the world. And they said, you've got to be kidding. Essentially, the International Energy Agency has said that from 1990 to 2012, that emissions have gone up 61%. Now think of that in historical terms. We're talking about a brief moment in history, 20 or so years, and emissions going up 61%. That was 2012. Since then, they've continued to rise. They slowed down a little bit, but they've gone up again this year. So emissions keep going up. So where is this transition to a low-carbon economy? The unions also said, everywhere we go, particularly in the global south, extractionism is running rampant. Fracking, drilling, mining, mountaintop removal. Basically extrajudiciary killing, assassinations of environmental and trade union leaders who oppose this agenda. So there was a resolution was developed on the floor that said that there needed to be a reclaiming and defense of the commons, that the market could not produce a sustainable economy or a sustainable ecological situation, and that we had to reclaim to the public what had been privatized, particularly in the energy sectors. And extractionism had to stop. There's no point saying that we can just sort of have a few incentives and market signals to get ourselves out of this. Meanwhile, of course, the carbon price that Nicholas Stern said was going to be introduced was tried in Europe. And it was supposed to be in place now globally at the level of around about $100 a tonne. This is all a bit wonky, but it's extremely important politically to grasp what has happened. In the ensuing 12 years, only 13% of global emissions are priced. And that 13%, the vast majority is under $10 a ton, which means it has, read my lips please, no effect whatsoever on reducing emissions. The price is too low. Who is pushing back against the price? The same corporations who are urging the policy community to introduce the price in the first place. Because they don't mind other people paying the price, they just don't want to pay it themselves. So we come up again to the confrontation with the system of profit. And Nicholas Stern, in the economics of climate change, believed that the green economy was going to be a major money-making bonanza for private companies. And all we needed to do as governments was to send some signals to the market and put the price on the pollution. Now, that resolution there was the beginning of a change in the global trade union debates. In 2012, after the Rio +20 talks, a few months later, 2 weeks before Superstorm Sandy hit the region, we had a meeting of 70 unions in New York City. And we said, what's really going on here? We're seeing rising emissions, we're seeing rising fossil fuels use, not falling. We're seeing rising energy demand globally to the level of 3% a year, which is having a dramatic effect on the global energy system and the ecology. And yes, renewable energy was rising, and rising very, very quickly. And the renewable energy companies like to tell us that the renewables are the future, so keep investing in us, keep giving us policy supports and subsidies, and then one day we'll have a full 100% renewables economy. But if we look at the data then, and we look at the data now, we see that renewables are on the margins of the global energy system, and will be on the margins for a long time unless we have public renewable power. I'll come back to the economics of that in a moment. So we developed a program called Resist, Reclaim, Restructure, which was the first Trade Unions for Energy Democracy document. And we documented what was really going on in the energy sector. And we said, resist, reclaim, restructure, at least offer some kind of framework to address the realities. First of all, resist the agenda of the fossil fuel companies globally. That more fossil fuels coming on, more refineries, more pipelines, more power stations, that was going to lock in, you've all heard the term carbon lock-in, more emissions for decades to come. If we don't stop it now, we're going to be stuck with those emissions. And the bad situation is going to become catastrophic. Reclaim, the second demand. To reclaim to the public the energy systems that have been privatized. And that also means demarketizing those systems that are still public. Many of them around the world are still publicly owned. But they operate as private companies. They accumulate money, they sell energy, they operate on the global markets. So you have the big ones like Eskom in South Africa, Sinopec in China. They are publicly traded corporations making money for investors. So they're publicly owned, but they act like private companies. So how do we reclaim these companies to serve the public good, which in many cases what they were set up to do in the first place? And lastly, restructure. That we needed a new energy system based on decentralized power, and that would allow communities to have a say in the future of energy systems because renewable energy technologies can be decentralized. So that was the 3 R's, if you like: resist, reclaim, restructure. Now we all said, well, that's mission impossible because everything is going against us. We have no chance of ever making this happen, but we at least have to have some kind of analysis for unions around the world to at least understand what was really going on and what their allies in the environmental movement should know is going on, because many environmental groups, and I'm sure many of you know this, are kind of enamored with the idea that private renewables are going to be the future and the big bad utilities are the problem. And so therefore all we got to do is give them some more subsidies and support, and then we'll end up with a low carbon energy system. Now, in the years that have transpired, have passed since, in the last few years, we've got a different situation, I think, on our hands. The The problems of fossil fuel use, as I said, are continuing. This is a global phenomenon. Yes, renewables are growing dramatically, but please, please, and many of you I'm sure know this, don't be fooled by the headlines that renewables are galloping forward at an inexorable speed. A lot of this is messaging. It's messaging for the renewables companies to attract private investment. It's also messaging to the politicians, keep giving us policy support, subsidies. Come back to that in a moment. So what we've done in the ensuing years is to deepen the analysis of this situation. The electricity system is crucial. If we can't control the power system globally, we will not be able to stabilize the climate. It's as simple as that. It's the biggest single contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, the largest consumer of coal by far, and gas. So we've got to decarbonize the power generation systems of the world. On top of that, we need to decarbonize the transport systems, which is the fastest growing greenhouse gas emissions in the world is in the transport sector right now. So how do we do that? Well, we need more renewable energy so we can have electric fleets, electric public transportation systems. We can't do that without more electricity. Then we have heating and cooling and cooking, all of those things that use fossil fuels, they have to be decarbonized as well. So where's all this electricity going to come from? How are we going to do this? There is a lot that can be accomplished by energy conservation. This is a very neglected area. But let's say, yes, there are some areas there where we can have less energy use or to reduce at least the growth in energy production. That's true. But then we've got 1.2 billion people who don't have electricity. So where are they going to get their electricity from if we want them to have a reasonable quality of life? So the good news is we know a number of things. We know that there's plenty of wind, sun, and wave and water power in the world, that a tiny fraction of it was harnessed, we would have enough electricity. The question is getting from that potential to a full decarbonization. So it gets a little bit wonky and technical, but here's, I think, where it comes down to real politics at the moment. Let's take Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has put a bill in the Senate, and as is Tulsi Gabbard in the House, which is an aspirational bill, of course, at this time, but it basically says we want 100%, the US to be 100% off fossil fuels by 2050. And the Gabbard bill is calling for 80% renewable energy by 2027. Does anybody know how much renewable energy is in the US system now? If you take hydro out, it's about 8 or 9%. So wind and solar is growing, but it's still a long way to go before it gets to that level. Hydro is largely static because it's the old dam systems that were established in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s under the New Deal. So where the growth has to come, it has to come from wind and solar. The bill doesn't say how it's going to happen. It just said states have to be authorized to make sure they get their power from renewable sources. Unless you're prepared to interfere with markets, control the pricing, control the technologies and deployment, that is not an achievable goal. We have to interfere with these markets. We need public renewable power. So it's a very practical question. This isn't big picture pie in the sky stuff. We have to deal with it. Now, how? Let me just spend a couple of minutes. How am I doing for time?
You're good.
No, I'm good. Thank you. All right. So that's a license to go on for another 20 minutes. So bear with me when I deal with a little bit of the economics of public power, because I'd like you to think about it and come back to me on it, cross-examine if you can. Let's have a debate about it. But it's crucially important to put forward this idea at this particular point in time. What makes renewable, where does the cost of renewable energy come from today? If we look at the model that was introduced in Europe with the privatization of the power systems, and eventually all over the world, the privatization of power, was to break up the old systems of power generation and unbundle them into competing units. This was before climate change was considered to be a very serious problem. So then the narrative becomes, if you want to protect the climate and reduce emissions, we have to have competitive electricity markets. The renewables companies, of course, wanted a piece of the action, and they echoed that message, saying these fossil fuel companies, these incumbent utilities are the problem, we're the solution, give us your support. Now, when we interrogate the economics of renewable power, what we see is this: the single most expensive part of it is the borrowing of capital. That's more costly than anything else. The fuel is cheap, there is no fuel. The sun doesn't come with a price tag, neither does the wind. The biggest cost is the price of borrowing money. And the reason why that price is high is because renewables are in a risky situation. Why are they in a risky situation? Because they are in a competitive market. The competitive market was put in place by the privatizers 30 years ago, thinking that was going to reduce costs. What it did was raise the risk for renewable energy companies. Everybody in the energy sector is at risk now. So what you have is investors look at that and say, we're not going anywhere near this. Used to be, your pension fund used to be in Con Edison or whatever the utility was. It didn't make much money, but it was a safe investment. Now, investors look at the traditional sector and the renewable sector and say, too risky. You don't want to put your money there. So the investment goes down. So then the message comes, well, how do we reach the climate targets? Well, we need to provide certainties to the investors. What is a certainty? A power purchase agreement. The power purchase agreement basically says, you agree in writing to buy power from me, a wind company or a solar company, at such and such a price. This price has to be enough to compensate the return on investment for the people who've invested in it, plus our profit levels. So what we have is built-in high costs that can only be reduced at this stage by subsidies. And it might be argued, well, what's wrong with a few subsidies? We subsidize fossil fuels, why can't we subsidize renewable energy? The problem has been, where it has happened, is the cost of the subsidies gets passed on to the consumers. It doesn't get passed on to the fossil fuel companies, it gets passed on to everybody else. So there's been a major pushback in Europe, which was the leader in renewable energy for the last 10 or 15 years. Germany is often used as an example. Investment in renewables have collapsed. So why has it collapsed? It's because they took away the subsidies and the companies couldn't stand. They couldn't, because of their costs of borrowing, they couldn't establish a foothold in the power sector, and we're seeing a reversal. Now, how do we avoid this? This is where we need to be clear. We need to lower the cost of capital. How do we do that? The best thing to do is not have private companies do it. Have public renewable energy companies established. That can, like the old systems of health, education, and power generation in utilities, you build the stuff, and then you charge a user fee, and then you pay back what you've had to put into the system. If you take the high interest rates out, because you're a government entity, you can borrow at a much lower level than if you're a private entity. They know that you can raise taxes to pay it. So a bank is going to say, oh, well, it's a government entity, it's not going to go broke. That lowers the risk and lowers the cost of borrowing. Then, when they produced the electricity, you then have a situation where you own and control the installations. It's not owned by a private company charging a power purchase agreement. So, in the few minutes I've got left, I want to say, so where is this analysis going? The other thing about reducing the cost is to do it at scale. If we're going to take the climate targets seriously, 85% reduction, net zero emissions according to the Paris Agreement by 2060, if we're going to take that seriously, it needs a massive deployment of renewable power. That will bring down the cost. That's the good news, because the more you do, the cheaper it's going to be. And so the programs of public renewable power make absolute sense from an economic standpoint. Now, who's running with this? Or is this so pie in the sky, it really is a waste of time? In the unions, which is where I mostly operate, we've seen unions picking up campaigns for public renewable power in many parts of the world now and beginning to change the narrative. Just in my own work with Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, we've got in Australia, the Queensland Labour Party has adopted public renewable power instead of power purchase agreements. In Canada, Naomi Klein and the LEAP Manifesto advocating for public power. In the Philippines, the public cooperative systems, which were built under the rural electrification, are threatened with privatization. The Filipino unions and the climate justice movements are fighting to defend public co-ops and urging them, giving them the opportunity to go into the development of renewables. In Nepal, which is rich in hydroelectric power, public renewable power is on the agenda of the left-wing government that was elected a few weeks ago. In Puerto Rico, there is a struggle over the threatened privatization of the utility. The utility isn't a particularly good utility, PREPA, quite a bad utility, very corrupt. But the movement there is demanding a new PREPA based on transparency, based on community control, to transition towards renewable technologies. I think the most encouraging example is the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, and I'll conclude on this with the 2 or so minutes I have left. 3 years ago, I went to Britain and we met with the unions, and they said, so what is this project, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy? We see you've got a few unions from Britain involved. We said, yeah, well, we believe that we need to have public power. We need to take back the power system in order to meet the climate targets, in order to drive renewables and have a fairer energy system. They said, well, that's never going to happen. It's mission impossible. It's not going to happen. I said, well, yeah, I know, it may not happen. It may be difficult now. But who knows what's going to happen 3 or 4 years from now? They said, well, we don't see it happening. So we got some unions involved and some unions who frankly sat on the fence. What happens? Corbyn decides he's going to run for leader of the Labour Party. He scribbles down a programme which included reclaiming the power system, which had been very poorly managed and de-invested under the privatisation system. It wasn't really much to do with climate change. It was more just it was a badly run, now multinational run system. Then, of course, he fights the general election on the same programme, public renewable power. And they said, oh, he's got no chance, he's going to be annihilated by Theresa May. And he ended up coming within 1% of a victory against Theresa May on a left-wing programme with all the major media against him. Of course, the Sanders campaign and the Corbyn campaign were talking to each other. The Sanders has put the bill in the Senate on the high level of ambition on climate protection. The same conversation is going on. Last September, a few months after the election, Jeremy Corbyn addressed the Trade Union Congress in Brighton, and the vote to support public renewable power, renationalisation, and basically remunicipalisation of the power system was passed unanimously. Now, what does this mean? It means that if there's a Labour government, the shadow minister, Rebecca Long-Bailey, met with the unions involved in this project, Unions for Energy Democracy, and said, we really don't know how to do this. This is not going to be easy. How do we take back the power system? So we're now in the process of developing an implementation plan that in the event, and I think it's a very strong possibility that Corbyn could be the next Prime Minister, that they will reclaim the power system. You say, well, that's only one country. But the crisis in the European renewable system, which is privately owned, is so deep right now that if Britain led the way, it could have an effect on Europe. And Europe has been the policy leader for the world around privatization, power purchase agreements, and private renewable power. So even though it gets a bit wonky and a bit technical, and we still have an enormous mountain to climb, I'd urge us all to try to take on board this idea of public renewable power. Let's do it on a non-profit basis. Let's control the power system. Let's move forward in the years ahead to decarbonize the transport system, the heating systems, and try to reclaim the energy sector. Because if we can't reclaim the energy sector, there won't be climate justice. There will not be equality. We need to include all communities, all unions, all organizations in that struggle, but to be clear about what the objectives are. And I think we have a chance of real success. So I'll stop there. Thank you.